Well, hello everyone, dealing with another random making encounter. Today we're going to make the floor is lava, some lava. I'm going to start out by creating the base of the diorama. The one thing to note here is it just needs to be kind of deep because we need to diffuse a lot of light throughout it. So that's why it's a really tall base for this particular diorama. You could use a box that you cut an opening in the top. There's all sorts of ways that you could build this. I'm using some 3mm MDF. I'll post some drawings, some files over on my Patreon page in case you happen to have a laser cutter kicking around that you want to laser some MDF. These are some standard RGB LED strips that you can get on a spool. Again, links for all of these will be provided down in the description, affiliate links, and these are the same types of LEDs that are neopixels. They're individually addressable RGB LED strips. I'm going to run 2 layers around. The idea here is to create edge lighting where I'm throwing a lot of light into the center of the diorama itself. Now there are a couple things I need to do. Since I'm trying to edge light a couple pieces of plexi, or at least the first layer of plexi, I need to space that up so that the actual edge of the plex is as close as possible to the sort of the center of the LEDs. So that's what this little spacer is going in. I'm going to give everything a quick coat of white paint just to help bounce that light around. And then I'm going to glue the first panel in. Now, one thing to note here, this is how I got that second strip to run around. I put a little bend in the strip. You can do that if you're really careful. It avoids having to solder the 2 strips together. A little lazy hack there. So you can see this first piece of rippled plex going in. The smooth side of this plexi is facing to the top of the diorama. And then I'm going to run some more of this adhesive, clear adhesive caulk around to glue the second panel in place. This is just more variety, more variation, and more diffusion. And in this case, the textured side is facing up so that the 2 textured sides are touching. Hope that makes sense. I'm going to do a resin pour here, so I want to make sure that this is sealed really well. So I'm running an additional bead of hot glue around the edge. This little piece that I'm tacking in, I'm not really doing much except tacking it in place, is to help hide the edges of that second row of LEDs. I hide the LEDs so that I don't get hot spots. And then I run one more strip around the edge that will support the back or the base. And you'll see that here in a minute. For that base, I'm just using some tag board, some chipboard, and I'm taking some tin foil. I'm using the satiny, the less reflective side. I don't want it to be super shiny and bright. And I'm just scrunching it up a little bit in areas that I know are going to be visible through the plexi, through the terrain. Kind of eyeballing it. And just to create more, again, as the light bounces around from that second row of LEDs, create a little bit of interest in the way that the light's being reflected. It's subtle, but definitely we do want something. I do want something as that backer that's going to bounce as much light up as possible. I'm going to drop this panel in, just tack it in place. It doesn't need to be really, seriously glued in. I may want to pull it out later and fiddle with it or try something different. So a couple little tacks. This is Arduino driven. I'll post the schematic up on Patreon for this board, but basically it's an Arduino, a little buck boost power booster to get the voltage up to 9 volts for the board from a 5-volt power supply. And that's really kind of all there is. There's a capacitor to help protect the LEDs and a resistor for the data line. Very straightforward. For the finish on the case, I wanted to use a Crackle varnish. Now, unlike my last project, I'm really happy with how this went, and it was one shot done. So the base layer here is a very dark charcoal. With Crackle varnishes, you can get all sorts of different effects, but I wanted this to be subtle. So your base layer is what's going to show through the cracks. And in this case, I wanted it to feel like charred or burnt wood or old lava. And so a really dark charcoal is my base coat, and then I'm applying a very, very heavy coat of the Crackle varnish. If you've never used Crackle varnish before, let's say Crackle varnish together, I repeat myself a lot, I find. You should practice on a couple scrap pieces because the effect you'll get varies based on how thick this layer goes down, this layer of finish, and then how thick or thin your top coat is. Once you start to put your top coat down after the Crackle has dried, you don't want to fuss with it. You really want to get this down in as much of a one shot, one coat step as possible, because once it starts to dry, it will begin to crack. And if you continue to paint into it, you'll basically just paint into the cracks and the effect will be lost. The amount of cracking really depends on a lot of factors that are out of your control. So you kind of have to just wing it, keep your fingers crossed, and hope for the best. In this case, I was very, very happy with where we landed. This has a few coats of polycryl spray, water-based polycryl over it to protect it, but I think it turned out really nice. It's very subtle, but yet it's still there. It also hides a lot of sins. The terrain is printable scenery, some ruins. I'll put an affiliate link down in the description. My basic process for these is once they're printed to give them a couple coats of a primer, filler primer, spray filler. This is an automotive spray primer filler, just to hide the layer lines. Then I'll hit it with a dark primer and then a zenithal highlight to start working the shadows, the lights, and the darks. I also really like the way that these terrain pieces go together. The shapes of them, they fit quite nicely. There's a logic to them. They seem to go together to create these little rivers of space between them. Now, this isn't really a painting video. It's more of a little bit of everything video, but my basic process is always the same, starting with a dark base layer and then gradually working up to lighter dry brushing, going in with washes, and basically just kind of working those back and forth. At this point, it's time to get these pieces glued in place or taped in place. I'm using some double stick tape. And this was my original layout. The front of the diorama is facing towards me, and I really realized that the dragon where I had it was kind of in a dumb position. It was back to the viewer basically, and I was not able to see all the coolness, which was the dragon's mouth and kind of the front of the dragon. And so I rethought the layout really quickly, making sure that I had as much open lava space as possible while making sure that the dragon was in an interesting position and where my hero would be able to be effectively positioned in relationship to that dragon. Now, this black or dark gray resin is intended to help sort of hide and diffuse the edges of the LED so that I don't see LEDs. I don't know if this was really necessary. It does add a little bit of something to it, but I don't think this was a super critical step at the end of the day. Your mileage may vary. You just want to make sure that it's very translucent. The second part of the pour was just clear. And the idea here is I'm pouring it into the middle and allowing that clear resin to push all of the dark resin further into the edges and into the corners. Now with resin, the one thing you do want to make sure is you're really working it into areas where the surface tension of the resin will prevent it from flowing. Now, once you've got resin in there, it will self-level pretty well, but you need to kind of get it into the nooks and crannies so that it can flow. Quick overnight cure on this. This was some fast cure resin. Again, I'll put links for all these goodies down below, but a quick overnight, and then we end up with this really smooth surface, which is not very lava-like. And so this is just some clear gloss Mod Podge. It holds texture pretty well. especially soft textures like this, and I did want this to be kind of goopy and flowy, and so I'm just working some Mod Podge around to create an interesting surface to our resin. Now, the observant ones in the crowd will have noticed that when I was laying out that terrain, the dragon was mostly painted, mainly painted, semi-painted, so we're traveling back in time to paint the dragon. This is my approach really for large pieces, and that is to start with a zenithal highlight. And I'm using, in this case, some Army Painter speed paints. These are intended in a lot of ways to be brushed on, but they airbrush really nicely. They're very, very, very transparent, and you can hit it pretty hard and pull it up a little bit and not have to worry about it really turning into a disaster. I'm using light greens and really predominantly greens on the surface, the top of the dragon, and then working in warmer colors on its belly and on the underside of the wings. Once I'm happy with that, I can go in and start to really pick out areas using more opaque paints, and then again coming in with the speed paints a little bit to really reinforce nooks and crannies and crevices. I don't think this is a competition level paint job, but this is certainly a fun diorama level paint job. I think it's definitely stands up to some scrutiny up close. Now, dioramas are about storytelling, and so I needed a little bit of story here. This is a poor little dude here that tried to steal the dragon's treasure and paid the price. I can't remember where I got this. This is a 3D printed skeleton. I'll have to see if I can dig up where this came from. But basic process is, again, speed paints, zenith over a zenithal highlight, and then working back in with more opaque paints and just kind of going back and forth, pushing lights and darks. Our hero was really driven by the story again, really driven by what I wanted the story to be. And so I went to my local game store, support your local game stores, and looked for a figure that was in the pose that I wanted. I wanted someone kind of a la Dragon Slayer to be, just have that shield up, bracing for the attack. And this is kind of what I could find. If I couldn't have found it at the game store, I probably would have resorted to 3D printing something. But again, I'm a little lazy, and it was easier to go find a mini than print one. So this is where we end, and I'm very happy with this figure. It's a great pose, and it's exactly what I wanted. Now, my son felt that the shield was the figure was a little too fresh from the adventuring road and needed some battle damage. He really struggled to get to the end of the campaign, and so we added a little bit of damage to the shield just to make it a bit more interesting. With everything painted up, it's time for some final gluing. So we'll drop our little arm in. This arm is really broken off only because the original pose did not support kind of having him laying on the side like this. So that's why I snapped that arm off and glued that in. And then I could go ahead and get the dragon glued into place. And the dragon needs to go in early because its direction of attack is going to really drive the position and pose of the hero figure. You can see on the right side, sort of serendipitously, that right column supported the edge of that wing. So it turned out to be a very, very stable glue up for the dragon. That was very unintentional. With the dragon in place, I can now position our hero so that they're braced for the onslaught, braced for the attack. The shield is up, and they are ready to take on their young green dragon. There's a little treasure glued in there. Make it all worthwhile, hopefully. Not sure they're always going to carry that all out. But with that in mind, I'm going to post the code for the LEDs down in the description. I'll post a little bit more robust version with some additional colors for the LEDs over on my Patreon page. It's very simple. I'll comment it heavily for everyone so that it hopefully makes sense. Speaking of Patreon, I'd like to shout out to my patrons. W, Jesse, Tina, Mary, Janet, and the newest member of our creative cabal, Max. Thank you so much. Your confidence and support goes a long way in helping create content like this. If you're interested in supporting content creation like this, be sure to check out my Patreon page. Be sure to hit that like, subscribe button, all of those good things that all of us content creators say over and over again. I hope you found some inspiration, some tips or tricks to help you on your creative journey. I wasn't really sure at times if this was really going to work out, but I think we kind of pulled it out in the end. It is great to spend time with you, and I look forward to seeing you as we build some more fantastic and fantastical worlds in miniature. Until then, I wish you the very best.